What's going on, people? My name is Alex Elliott. I'm an audio and visual artist, and welcome to my channel. Now, on this channel, I share all of the behind the scenes on how I get certain things, how I do certain things in my production, as well as gear reviews and as well as plugin reviews. But on my main channel is where I share all of my music. But today we're going to be talking about how I make my drums slap. Now, first thing I'll do is I'll play you this track with the drums and all of the mixing in, and then I'll take it off just so you can hear what it sounds like. So as you can hear, a massive difference, right? Now, I work in a way that's called top-down mixing. And the reason why I do this is because during my career, I've done production, I've done mixing, I've done live shows, but consistently across the board, this approach worked really well because it meant that I could have a template which stays the same. And it's a case of me dragging different files and different stems into that template and leveling them out. So the first thing I'm doing is I take my kick drum out of my drum bus. And the reason why I do this is because 9 times out of 10, the sound that I want to achieve in my transients, in my mid-range, in my high-end stuff that's in my drums is not the same processing that I want to do to my kick. Case in point, let me show you what happens when I drag my kick into this bus. Now, in this particular case, you may actually prefer how the kick sounds going into that bus, but the reality is I wanted the kick to feel a lot warmer and I wanted the top end of my drums to have that snap and that grip to them, which is why I separate these two out. It also means that I gain the ability and the power to take my kick and my bass and to compress and saturate and clip them as one sound. So whenever I want to have more bass in my overall mix, I can literally go to my kick and bus fader and turn this up and down. However, if you want to know more about that, stay tuned to the end of the video because I will tag some videos that will pop up where you can watch those to go into more detail about that. But first and foremost, what am I doing on my drum bus? The first thing I'm doing is saturation. Now, even though I'm using Raw, which is an Ableton built-in plugin, you can accomplish the same thing with Ozone. I'm not really doing any saturation on the low, the mid, and I'm just doing a little bit on the high end, as well as some subtle compression that's being done on this plugin. But essentially, you could take something like SSL, for example, and Ozone Exciter, split this into 2 bands, so maybe we drop at 3K. I usually like to use tape for my top end. You could drop that to around about 5.5. And then here, just keep it on triode and probably do around about 3. And then I'll dial in my compression now and just have a listen to what these two are going to do to the sound, just by themselves, actually. I'm going to put the saturation before the compression. I'm going to dial back the high end a little bit because I don't want it to sound too sharp. So you can hear how that's just helping the transients to poke through. And then it's also helping the, I guess, high end to kind of stand out a little bit more. But instead of using those 2 plugins, I'm using Raw to get the same effect. So this is Raw on and Raw off. And on Raw, it's a little quieter because I'm level matching it down too. So you get the point, right? It's just helping that high end and transient to poke out a little bit more. Now, after this, I'm doing something very interesting, which is I'm going into spiff, and I'm allowing spiff to do somewhere between 2 and 3.6, depending on how I want it to sound. But I essentially like using spiff as my transient designer, because essentially it becomes a multi-band transient designer that kind of just listens to the sound and dynamically moves and shifts and boosts things as it goes through. So let's have a listen to what happens when I add spiff. Now, bear in mind, you can use any transient designer that you want to use, but I'm using spiff. Now, of course, you can hear that there's a lot of transient energy increase, but at the same time, the whole thing's getting louder, right? Now, this is what I meant by top down, because this next plugin I'm going to add in is the P44 Magnum by Pulsar Modular, but you can use something like maybe Decapitator going into a clipper to get like in the same kind of area. But for me personally, I'll always use a P44 because it sounds the absolute best. And what I'm using this for is saturation, but then also clipping. Now I have my ceiling on this plugin set to -9 dB, which means nothing above -9 dB, will get through. And this is on before I start working. Have a listen to how this sounds when I engage this and when I disengage this. Now you can hear there's a massive volume increase, a massive energy increase, but this is what I meant by top-down mixing. I know that I don't want anything in my drums to go above -9. Reason being is I have my transient in my drums around -9 dB. Then it means that once I add in my kick, once I add in instruments, once I add in vocals, generally that gives me a decent amount of headroom when it comes to my stereo bus. And this is on from the beginning. So what would end up happening if I was just to like start this from scratch? This is something I produce, but if I was to get stems from someone else, when I drag these in, straight off the bat, these would of course be at like 0, right? And it's gonna sound awful. Have a listen to this. Completely unbalanced, right? I don't know, it might be someone's bag, but it's not mine. And what I do is I don't actually do that much processing to my individual drum stems unless I'm going to go out the box to get a little bit of EQ or saturation or something. But generally, like, I'm doing sound design things like using texture to add like a little high-end white noise on top of the snare so it just cuts through a little bit more. And then here it's just a high pass filter. I'm quite minimal when it comes to my individual drum stems. So what I like to do is when I drag the stems into this kind of group is I just turn these down until it sounds balanced with the mix. And as I said, because that clipping is never going to go above -9 dB, I'm never worrying about my headroom per se. I'm purely just listening for when does it get to a point where it kind of sounds good. So let me showcase what that looks like to you now. So around there sounds perfect to me. And honestly, because I have my template set up in this way, mixing is really something that's so easy for me now, because I know that I've got hard thresholds set all throughout my mix. And I do a similar thing on my music bus. I do a similar thing on my kick and bass bus. And then I do a similar thing on my master bus, which is just this incremental stages of saturation clipping. So if you're someone who's struggling to get your drums to slap and you've been thinking about it from a stem level, like what do I need to do to the actual kick? What do I need to do to the actual snare? I urge you to start to think about top-down mixing and approaching things in a way where how can I make this group sound a certain way and how can I make this group sound a certain way, and essentially allow anything that you're doing on a stem level to be corrective things or sound design things. That's my approach. Now, like I said, this is my channel where I do all of my kind of tutorials behind the scenes, how I accomplish what I'm doing. If you want to know more about my music, however, then be sure to follow my music channel, which is Who is Alex Elliott Music. And as promised, the videos are around about here somewhere for the other tutorials to break down a little bit more about my template. My name is Alex Elliott, and I look forward to seeing you all next time.